No fire, no furnace. How settlers survived winter in the Wild West. Relaxing history. It's a cold morning in the Montana Territory, sometime around 1873. You'd know it's morning, not because there's a clock ticking softly by the bedside. Good luck finding one of those. But because the rooster, a deeply opinionated fellow named Bartholomew, is screaming again. The frost on the inside of the cabin windows has formed its usual delicate patterns, gently mocking the idea that glass is supposed to keep the cold out. And yet, the kettle over the barely glowing coals lets out a soft puff of steam. Not much of a fire, just a charred attempt at warmth, but it's all they've got. After all, cutting firewood in the middle of winter is what some call an upper body workout and others call slow motion freezing to death. Life in the Wild West wasn't all shootouts and saloons, as popular lore might suggest. No, the real danger wasn't an outlaw with a six-shooter. It was trying to defrost your socks without setting them ablaze. You might be wondering, how did these settlers survive bitter winters with no central heating, no electric blankets, and sometimes not even an outhouse that wasn't trying to blow away in the wind? Well, the answer begins, rather stubbornly, with porridge. Gruel thick enough to stand a spoon in and bland enough to prevent excitement. Oats were cheap, durable, and even in the chilliest frontier cabin, could be coaxed into a kind of stoic, steaming comfort. Breakfast porridge, lunch porridge, and, if you were feeling adventurous, surprise beans for dinner. That's porridge with beans, not instead of. Sometimes, if company came by, biscuits were served. Not fresh, mind you, but served. Cabins weren't built to keep out the cold so much as they were built fast. A little like stacking wooden shoeboxes and hoping no raccoons applied for tenancy through the roof. Logs were stacked, horizontally, gaps sealed with a charming mortar of mud, straw, moss, and small dreams. But cold air is rather spirited. She finds her way in, zigzagging through every crevice, whistling softly into your ears, wrapping herself affectionately around your ankles until your knees file for numbness. You might sleep under every blanket you own, or more accurately, every blanket that hasn't been repurposed as an outer wall. Fully dressed, boots on, hat clasped, fingers crossed for the cruel wind to pass you by this night, and still your breath will puff up in little clouds that look like tiny steam engines chugging their way across your pillow. Now, about the bed. If you were lucky, it was a dying wagon repurposed as a sleeping platform. Less lucky? 2 straw sacks on either end of the floor with a stubborn Labrador in between, licking itself majestically and refusing to budge, despite your polite and increasingly panicked requests. Where there was no wood, and in the treeless prairies, firewood was a kind of mythical currency. Settlers turned to the earth's more fragrant offerings, buffalo chips. Yes, literal dried dung. Imagine crouching down in a winter field, mittens damp, wind at your back and dignity somewhere 30 yards behind you, collecting the West's strangest alternative energy source. But they burned hot, smelled a little peppy, and they didn't spark like some kinds of wood might. Children would gather them as part of their chores, giggling but also grimacing, a frontier rite of passage, if ever there was one. Then came the great community minds, neighbors bundling together in a fashion we might now call a support group, but in those days simply called not dying alone. Shared fire pits were common. One family might host another through a particularly harsh month, sleeping side by side like cod in a barrel, legs overlapping accidentally, intentionally, or purely by the laws of physics. The roof would drip, icicles. the stew would sizzle softly, and someone, always someone with an unfortunate fondness for fiddle reels, would attempt to tune, even if two of the strings were now repurposed as suspender reinforcements. In these early homesteads, the cold wasn't just weather, it was character. A loud, uninvited house guest who drank all the coffee and refused to leave. But somehow, between the quilts, the cow pies turned kindling, and the ever-simmering pot of grits, people made it to spring. Perhaps not with all their toes, but with enough stories to keep hearts warm for generations. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, as the frost grows art across the shutters and the fiddle fades into one last sleepy reel, let's imagine the drifting snow settling over that little log cabin as gently as slumber itself. The first bite of winter came not with a howl, but a whisper. At the edge of the plains, under a sky so wide it looked borrowed from a daydream, settlers began to notice the subtle signs. The wool in their stockings felt a little more grateful. The wind stopped teasing and started advising. And if your coffee froze while you were still grinding the beans, well, friend, that meant it was finally time. Time to batten down the hatches of homes that weren't so much homes as they were improved wooden guesses. Shacks built in a hurry with all the architectural rigor of a kid's fort under a dining room table. Back then, insulation was just a word they didn't know yet. And if anyone had duct tape, they were probably elected mayor. But make no mistake, these folks were clever. Freshly arrived from a variety of places where winter at least had the decency to come with hearths and porridge, they turned necessity into a sort of gritty frontier poetry. If you didn't have a furnace, and very few did, it wasn't time to panic. It was time to straw up. Straw insulation. Yes, before there was pink fiberglass insulation or spray foam, there was whatever God happened to put in a barn. It turns out, bales of straw make fairly decent thermal padding, and if you packed it tight between the outer log walls and inner boards, it could hold in just enough heat to keep your buffalo robe from becoming a permafrost sculpture. Speaking of buffalo robes, let's not understate their importance. These natural shaggy cloaks were the gold standard of frontier survival. Not only were they thick enough to fend off even Dakota winds, but they also served as the colonial version of an all-purpose winter wearable. Part blanket, part coat, part personality. Now, for those who are fancy or had recently won a poker game, there might be a small cast iron stove in the middle of your one-room abode. These contraptions were beloved, temperamental, and possibly responsible for more marriages surviving the winter than any preacher or therapist could ever claim. They were so valuable that entire families slept with one eye open to make sure it didn't grow legs and walk away in the night. Theft was real. So was frostbite. But still, for many, there was no stove. So instead, they built fires outside. That's right, small controlled fires near the entrance to catch some warmth and smoke. And maybe, just maybe, trick the cruel night into thinking there was nothing tasty inside to freeze. Then they dash back inside, shut the door, and huddle. Huddling was not a hobby. It was an art form. Families became professional cuddlers, sleeping in tight, overlapping arrangements that would make a Tetris champion weep. Elders, infants, and dogs rotated like rotisserie chickens through the prime central spots. The dog, of course, knew its value and judged accordingly. Food, when it could be coaxed from unforgiving cellars or snow-covered caches, served a second purpose beyond keeping folks alive. You see, Cooking something like beans or a rabbit stew added precious heat and even more precious smells to a cold, silent room. And though cooking smells were a luxury, burn smells, well, they were reassuring too, in a way. Ah, Pa might say, poking at something that used to be supper, warm and ruined, still better than cold and raw. They lined their walls with quilts, rugs, and, when all else failed, pages from old catalogues. Practical, barely, effective, not entirely, but charming, utterly. The walls seemed to whisper back with advertisements for bonnets and corsets, as if gently reminding the household that somewhere civilization still existed, somewhere with dry feet and proper undergarments. The shoes, by the way, were another story. Wet socks were a seasonal hazard, and boots, when they dried, did so into shapes resembling ancient pottery. Toughness wasn't optional in winter. It was woven into the soles. Toes went tingly. Frost hung so thick on beards that you'd swear half the population had aged 20 years overnight. And no matter how many covers you layered, you'd find yourself waking in the night, nose-shaped icicles forming upon your pillow. But the night would pass, eventually. Dawn always came, sheepish and pale, like a child apologizing for being late. And as light filtered through frost-glazed windows, casting lacy ghosts upon the walls, the settlers slowly exhaled. Another night survived, another trick of winter endured without furnace or flame. Just warmth, wit, and the quiet brilliance of huddled hope. But as the sun rose, one question lingered very practically in every settler's mind. How exactly does one fetch water when the bucket is frozen solid? An icy mystery that we'll quietly walk toward. Next, beneath a sky of prairie stars, tucked somewhere between frostbitten resolve and questionable carpentry, early homesteaders began the long, chilly waltz of Western winter survival. And no, most of them didn't have fireplaces, because if they did, this wouldn't be much of a story, would it? See, when you think of a cozy log cabin, maybe your brain offers a crackling hearth, a kindly grandma knitting in an armchair, and a steaming pot of stew with mysterious chunks floating in it. But for a good number of settlers in the American West, the home was, let's be gracious and call it rustic. And the stew, possibly more hopeful than edible. Fireplaces, you see, were actually terrible at heating homes. Sure, they looked charming on a biscuit tin, but they were dreadfully inefficient. Most of the heat went right up the chimney to warm the birds. You had to huddle so close to feel anything that your knees were sunburned, while your back froze stiff like a rawhide belt in January. So, many settlers didn't even bother with grand stone hearths, not when they could build simpler, thriftier heating contraptions, or, quite often, learn to live strategically with the cold. Think of it less like suffering and more like an elaborate game of winter hide-and-seek, where warmth was the ultimate prize. Cue the sod house, a sort of prairie hobbit hole made of tightly stacked grass turf bricks. Glamorous? No. Beige? Absolutely. But as insulation fortresses go, sod homes were overachievers. Thick walls of compacted earth kept out the wind and preserved just enough interior heat to prevent the family's eyebrows from freezing off overnight. Most had a central stove, always dangerously enthusiastic, and usually fueled by buffalo chips. Yes, that's a polite term for dried bison droppings. The Wild West, where even the fuel had a personality. And for those lacking in prairie poop or enough wood to justify a stove, ingenuity was their true bedfellow. They lined walls with newspaper, which not only added insulation, but gave the mice something stimulating to read during their nightly scurryings. One common household trick: heating bricks on whatever fire you dared start, wrapping them in cloth and tucking them in bed like medieval hot water bottles. These charmingly hazardous heat holders were often passed from one family member to the next, rotating warmth like some sort of thermal relay team. Windows, when they existed, were often sealed shut with rags or even smeared with lard to trap in precious warmth. True, it made seeing outside a bit like looking through soup, but who needs to gaze at miles of barren snowdrift anyway? The real landscape was inside, the walls, the people, the quiet war for body heat. Now, don't let the simplicity fool you. These settlers became masters in temperature management. Entire families often slept in one bed, not for reasons of kindness, but because your cousin's shins were an underrated heat source. Every layer counted, both on the body and in bed. Feather ticks, old coats, quilts made from anything that could be sewn without protest. Even dogs were drafted as nighttime heating devices, curled at the foot as living fur foot warmers. Don't worry, they were usually on board, especially compared to the alternative of a frozen barn. Clothing was strategy, not style. Multiple pairs of woolen socks, sometimes all wholly in exactly the same spot. Drawers upon drawers of long underwear, the kind that buttoned, itched, and generally tried to climb into your soul. You learned fast not to take them off completely at night. Stripping down in January was for the dangerously optimistic or slightly delirious. And yet, despite, or maybe because of, these rough comforts, there was something steadying about it all. A kind of shared understanding between snow-covered roofs, frost-laced windows, and the odd creak of a log wall settling for the night. The West didn't promise warmth, it promised the promise of it. And when warmth came, it felt earned, like a reward for simply enduring. So, while today we complain about adjusting the thermostat from 72 to 71, these early settlers counted comfort in the number of body parts that hadn't gone numb. A hot drink? A miracle. A draftless corner? Utopia. And a quiet moment, nestled in a bundle of patched quilts, listening to the wind howl its hopeless arguments outside. Well, that was peace. Somewhere out in that quiet, someone would stoke the stove with one last suspiciously rounded piece of fuel, tuck the children under a pile of every blanket the frontier could muster, and settle in beside a window smeared with bacon fat. No fire, no furnace, but they had each other, a particularly warm brick, and a well-earned truce with winter. And in the dark, muffled world of snow and sod, the question remained, what did they eat that didn't freeze solid before morning? There's something quietly defiant about entering January with only a log cabin, one pair of long johns, and an optimism born mostly of stubbornness. In the American West, winter came like a guest that never got the hint. It stayed long, said little, and froze absolutely everything. If you think winter nowadays is bad, try surviving one with no central heat and a door that howled eerily every time the wind remembered it existed. The settlers didn't just cope, they got creative. Lacking a furnace, they turned to what they had: ingenuity, chilled chickens, and a great many blankets. Oh yes, blankets were the unsung heroes of frontier fashion, often stacked in such numbers that it became difficult to detect where the human ended and the quilts began. It was said that if you could move under them, you didn't have enough. But let's start with the architecture, or perhaps functional shivering enclosure is more accurate. Log cabins were the predominant dwelling of choice, partly because trees were free, and partly because someone had convinced themselves that putting wet clay between logs would count as insulation. It did. Barely. Upon building, settlers stuffed the spaces between logs with mud, straw, or anything reluctant to burn. This technique, known as chinking, was intended to block the cold, though in high winds, it mostly served as insulation for the mice who promptly moved in. Inside, the fireplace reigned supreme, not just as a source of heat, but as the family television, cooking range, and general reminder that fire was man's original frenemy. Fireplaces were notoriously inefficient. Roughly 80% of the heat went straight up the chimney, waving goodbye to the family it was supposed to warm. But don't worry, the smoke often stayed behind, curling lazily around the ceiling and everyone's lungs. Now, supplies. Settlers knew to plan for winter like it was war, which, in some ways, it was. Without the luxuries of Instacart, they had to prep everything in advance. Vegetables were pickled, smoked meat hung from rafters, and root cellars were dug with all the excitement of someone building their own underground kingdom of turnips. These curved earthen pantries stayed cool in summer, and just above demoralizingly frigid in winter. If you curled up in one, you'd probably die, but your potatoes would last beautifully. Speaking of potatoes, these humble tubers got settlers through many long months with not much more than a shrug and a side of salt. Potatoes, beans, salt pork, and cornbread formed the holy quartet of cabin cuisine. Breakfast looked a lot like last night's dinner, and lunch was often a stew of previous enthusiasm. Yet, hearty meals meant warmth, and anything cooked was, frankly, a miracle when your fingers refused to uncurl. Now, let us turn to the beds, or what could be called beds, with a loving dose of charitable language. Often constructed with ropes strung between wooden frames, these beds needed regular tightening. Hence the phrase, sleep tight. A reminder not of comfort, but of how the ropes would sag and deposit you directly onto the floor if neglected. And the floor, dear listener, was only ever one cracked board away from sub-zero existentialism. Under the bedding, you'd find feather ticks, woolen blankets, fur pelts, and sometimes, you guessed it, more people. That's right. Family sleeping arrangements were democratic and thermal. Body heat wasn't awkward. It was essential. Babies, grandparents, and that one cousin who never stopped snoring all shared the bed because hypothermia doesn't care about your personal space. Clothing wasn't just for fashion. It was part of the heating strategy. At night, you slept with your socks, mittens, and sometimes your boots on. Nightcaps, once a staple of every bedtime story, were not quaint accessories, but wholly necessary if you enjoyed keeping your ears attached. And yet, despite the odds and occasional frostbitten toe, spirits remained resilient. Stories were told around fires, such as they were. Fiddle music bounced warmly off rough-hewn walls, and the quiet of a snow-covered prairie gave even the coldest night a kind of hush, like the land exhaled in white. For those awaiting the thaw, winter was endured with grit, grace, and a deeply romantic view of spring. But that's a tale for later. For now, let the snow fall gently, let the fire flicker and settle in, as we listen to how warmth was hunted, hauled, and sometimes hilariously improvised, right on cue during a particularly drafty moment in the outhouse. By late November, the ground in the Dakota Territory could no longer decide whether to be soil or stone. It crunched underfoot like stale cornbread, frozen into stubborn ridges. The great wagons were long since parked, their canvas tops sagging gently like elderly shoulders, and the settlers, still blinking the dust of October from their lashes, began the gentle panic of preparing for a winter they hoped wouldn't kill them. Now, contrary to dramatic dime novels, Not every frontier family faced down blizzards with a shotgun, a faithful dog, and pure grit, though grit was in liberal supply. What many had instead were soddies, homes built quite literally from earth. Sod houses, packed with prairie grass and stubborn optimism, were small, musty, and incredibly insulating. As long as you didn't mind your wallpaper occasionally sprouting mushrooms or a friendly vole poking its nose through the pantry wall, it was quite cozy. But heating such homes in winter, well, that's where the creativity kicked in. Firewood, the romanticized fuel of prairie lore, was in tragically short supply. The Western Plains were not known for their healthy tree populations. In fact, the nearest forest was often a week's ride away, assuming you had a horse that hadn't frozen into a popsicle or wandered off in search of an easier life. So settlers turned instead to what, in polite society, we shall delicately call buffalo chips. Yes, buffalo droppings. Once dried in the sun and stacked neatly like sinfully rustic Jenga blocks, these fragrant fuel substitutes burned hot, slow, and with a scent that would best be described as full-bodied. Children were often assigned the noble task of buffalo chip collection. Picture it, rosy-cheeked youths trotting through the grasslands with baskets, giggling over who found the biggest patty. It was wholesome in the way only a history teacher with tenure could appreciate. But when even those ran low, some families got astonishingly inventive. Corn cobs, twisted hay ropes, and even dried-up prairie roots, known as pudding sticks, went into the stove. And if that sounds like a diet rather than a heating strategy, well, sometimes the lines blurred. Heat or eat was the ongoing debate most winter mornings. Most cabins employed a cast-iron stove at the center of the main room, a squat metallic beast that devoured any offering with equal fury. It was the heart of the home, both literally and metaphorically. Stews simmered on its top, socks dried clumsily near its sides, and the cat, if you had one, spent 20 hours a day pretending to be too regal to let her tail catch fire. Of course, heat didn't stretch far. Most frontier families bundled up indoors like walking laundry piles. Thick quilts, many made from scraps of old trousers or curtains long since faded, piled high on beds. Mothers often stitched through the night, not just for warmth, but for sanity. There's something about hand sewing your 63rd square of reindeer patterned flannel that wards off winter-induced despair. Layering became a fine art. Children wore so many undergarments, their own parents occasionally lost track and misplaced them. It wasn't unusual to wear a cap to bed, nor was it odd to wake up with frost on the blanket. Inside the house, spitting in the wash basin could produce a miniature glacier, and yet folks by and large got through it. They might have been cold, but they created warmth in stranger ways. They told stories, tall tales about talking wolves and haunted outhouses, the most terrifying of all locales on a 3 a.m. prairie excursion. Parents read aloud if they could, by lamplight that flickered like an overworked firefly. And neighbors, when the wind wasn't howling too loud or the snow hadn't barricaded the door shut, might show up with molasses cookies wrapped in gingham and stay a few hours longer than necessary, because really, warmth on the prairie came as much from people as it did from stoves. And yet, even with all their sock layering, chip burning, and community cookie distribution, settlers had one final weapon in their arsenal against winter's grip, the root cellar. But that's a story buried deep, cool, dark, and waiting patiently just beneath the frost-hardened earth. On the prairie, where the wind whistled like a nosy neighbor and snow fell sideways with alarming personality, Western settlers faced the question every modern camper asks by 5 p.m. How in blue blazes are we going to stay warm tonight? Wood, you see, was a bit of a luxury. Those iconic sweeping plains weren't exactly teeming with forests. If you wanted a crackling fire, you had to either import wood from somewhere with trees, usually expensive, or get creative. And creativity, as it turns out, was abundant among folks whose lives regularly depended on it. Enter the buffalo chip, or, as settlers so delicately called them, prairie coal. No, not gourmet snacks. These were dried bison droppings. Yes, truly. Bison, good old massive shaggy humpbacked bison, were nature's unsung providers. Not only a source of food, hide, tools and portable shelter accessories, but also, it turns out, a surprisingly efficient heating solution. After the chips dried out in the sun, settlers would collect them lovingly, perhaps while pretending they were gathering daisies. Then, once night fell and temperatures dropped to a level best described as not survivable, they'd toss the chips into a stove or stove-like object and let them burn. Chips burned surprisingly clean with very little smoke and provided enough heat to cook a stew and warm a room. Well, warm it some. Not quite Caribbean breeze warm, but perhaps at least slightly less dangerous. And speaking of rooms, let's talk about what passed for insulation. The classic Western homestead was, at least in its early stage, more ambition than architecture. Many early homes were dugouts, holes in the side of hills, sometimes with a wooden front. What these lacked in grandeur, they made up for in stability. Underground living meant that temperatures swung less drastically, and with a few quilts nailed over the doorway, a homesteader could ride out winter in something that oddly resembled a hobbit's wine cellar. A very chilly, slightly smelly hobbit. If they managed to upgrade to a sod house, blocks of earth, grass roots included, the insulation improved. The walls were thick, earthy, and frankly, determined. Rain and snow didn't get in easily, and the wind had a much harder time rattling your senses. These sod houses weren't necessarily dry, and no one would describe them as bright, but they could be surprisingly snug. Plus, they came with a complementary side of earthworms, moss corners, and the delightful aroma of damp soil, the original cabin scent. Now, to sleep through the night in such conditions, settlers had to master the art of layering. Wool was king. Sheep, the MVPs of uncomfortable hugs, provided warm clothing and bedding materials. Thick woolen nightshirts, hand-knit stockings, and endless quilts were the weaponry against the cold. Sometimes people even slept in their coats, or boots, or, if things got dire, with the cow. Some journal entries allude to settlers keeping animals inside during the cruelest winter nights. Not so much for companionship as for shared body heat, and a reminder that at least someone in the room knew what they were doing outdoors. Heat was sometimes also found in bricks or stones, warmed by the fire and tucked under bedding. If you've never cuddled a warm rock while listening to wolves howl, have you truly wintered? And while homes lacked insulation as we know it, clever folks developed what might best be called human ingenuity via quilt. Curtains were hung not just on windows, but as room dividers to section off smaller areas that were easier to heat. Beds were crowded together. Entire families might sleep in a single room, which made conversation lively and privacy a distant dream. But it kept noses frost-free, and in the end, who needs privacy when survival is a group project? When wealth allowed, or priorities were shuffled accordingly, some homesteaders installed wood-burning stoves, marvels of metal that replaced open hearths and allowed for cooking, heating, and even the illusion of domestic harmony. Cast iron marvels humming softly behind layers of soot, holding the promise of hot beans and warm toes. Winter survival in the West had very little to do with fireplaces and everything to do with adaptability. If you could burn it, wear it, burrow into it, or convince it to share body heat, you used it. Being warm wasn't about luxury. It was a scrappy ballet of resourcefulness, where humble buffalo droppings earned a star role and everyone danced in wool socks. But there was another frontier within this frozen one, the delicate politics of shared space, shared beds, and the ever-complicated relationship between proximity and patience, which of course we'll tiptoe into next. A few miles west of anywhere in particular, tucked beneath a quilt of frost and stubborn buffalo grass, stood the kind of log cabin that looked like it had been assembled lovingly by a man with only one usable thumb and a saw he didn't fully understand. The chinking between the logs was made from mud, moss, and, according to local legend, a secret family recipe involving mashed beans and a little resignation. Inside such humble abodes, in the Wild West, settler families faced the icy rudeness of winter with the sort of brave optimism usually reserved for fictional characters and particularly determined squirrels. But make no mistake, these folks had no fire blazing in a polished hearth, no cast iron furnace humming with the confidence of Victorian technology. No, what they had was smouldering cow pies, a few drafty quilts, and sometimes the body heat of a dozen children all stuffed into one bed like biscuits in a Dutch oven. Let us begin there, on the subject of beds and the mysterious endeavour of staying warm in one. In winter, Western families treated bedtime like a tactical operation. You didn't just go to bed, you entered it. A nightly migration saw everyone shuffle toward the central sleeping area, the one bed large enough to host a family meeting and a game of cards if required. Parents, children, an unfortunate uncle, perhaps a goat still recovering from frostbite. It all went under one patchwork blanket that had seen better decades. The bed itself was usually a straw mattress atop a wooden frame built by someone with more heart than hammer skills. Straw, being the insulation of choice for centuries, had the pleasant quality of absorbing body heat and then immediately giving it away to any passing breeze, leaving its occupants in a classic dilemma: move and invite the cold in, or stay motionless and let your leg fall completely asleep. Meanwhile, clothes were not so much removed as repurposed. Flannel and wool layers weren't folded neatly away on a balmy winter evening. They were worn right into bed, along with socks, scarves, and occasionally a fur hat shaped like something that once had opinions. Settlers often believed that if you were cold at night, it was your own fault for showing skin like some kind of French aristocrat. Underneath those layers, heat was mostly a communal affair. Children acted as small fidgety heaters, squirming their way into the warm crooks of elbows and knees. Sometimes, livestock filled in for warmth when the children had the good sense to stay still. A calf laid next to the bed, softly puffing steam, was more useful than any fireplace that hadn't been invented locally. But perhaps the strangest and most whispered about tool in the settlers' winter arsenal was the bed warmer. A flat metal pan filled with hot coals slid beneath the covers moments before occupation. The idea sounds lovely, in an 18th century spa day kind of way. In practice, it was mainly a test of timing and courage. Leave it in too long, and you singe the sheets. Too short, and you got to climb into a bed that felt like it had been refrigerated for the purpose of discouraging optimism. Some settlers with daring to spare also used heated bricks wrapped in cloth or stone jars filled with boiling water. These items were put at the foot of the bed, ready to radiate heat and mild paranoia. You never forgot the time your foot met the scalding end of a poorly wrapped rock. Daytime brought no mercy, but plenty of multitasking. Women wore skirts layered thickly enough to have their own zip code, and children fetched wood with such frequency they threatened to become part of the furniture. Indoors, meals were essential pretext for cooking, warming the body before and during eating. Every pot of beans doubled as a hand warmer, every loaf of bread a brief moment of hope you could cradle. Outside, winter was a long negotiation. Wind whispered through every gap in construction and likely insulted your ancestors on its way through. Snow piled against doors like it was trying to help with insulation, while windows, precious, rare luxuries, became fogged and frosted with dreams of warmer realms. Yet despite it all, the chill, the drafts, the relentless simplicity, these hardy settlers engineered the art of surviving winter without so much as a furnace fan. The secret was never in what they had, but who. Family, community, and the shared understanding that if everyone just huddled a little tighter, both body and spirit stood a better chance. And somewhere between the soggy mittens and warmed stones, they found a way, night by night, to thaw even the cruelest western winter. Eventually, even the longest night gives way to morning, and perhaps, if you listen closely, you might hear the soft clatter of tin as someone prepares a breakfast, oddity settlers depended on for warmth and hope. If you've ever boiled your boots and called it supper, you might have what it takes to survive a frontier winter. But for the rest of us, shivering in buildings with central heat and modest plumbing, it'd be easy to assume that during a Wild West winter, pioneers heated their cabins with mighty stone fireplaces the size of small volcanoes. Let's correct that cozy mental image right away. Because in truth, many settlers didn't have fireplaces at all, nor stoves, nor anything resembling a modern-day heater. Imagine stepping into a one-room log cabin in the middle of the Wyoming plains, wind howling through the gaps in the logs like a ghost auditioning for the winter choir. The door has a habit of not fully closing, and when it does, it closes with a suspicious creak that suggests it may never open again. The roof leaks in 3 places, and you're expected to sleep 6 feet from the makeshift chimney, which smokes more into the cabin than out of it. So how did these folks survive? One word: insulation. And by insulation, I mean dirt. Glorious, dependable, never out of stock dirt. Early settlers, especially those who pioneered the Great Plains, often lived in sod houses, affectionately termed soddies. These were essentially earthen igloos. Thick walls, sometimes 2 feet deep, were constructed by slicing large brick-like chunks of grass-covered soil and stacking them like loamy Lego. The result was a house that looked like Mother Nature had tried to build her own cabin and quit halfway through. But it worked. The sod kept in heat, muffled the wind, and served as insulation. You might also wake up face to face with a worm that had moved into your wall during the night. But hey, rent is rent. If you were luckier, say, you had timber available. That is, you didn't settle in a place where the trees had all politely recused themselves from existing. You might build a log cabin and try your luck stuffing the cracks with chinking, a mysterious paste made of mud, straw, and whatever your mule coughed up last week. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped keep out drafts the way a determined toddler keeps out monsters by hiding under the covers. It mostly worked on belief. And then there was the whole matter of heating. Most cabins didn't have those romantic fireplaces you see in movies, because in many territories, folks had neither the stonework experience nor the time to fuss around with them. Instead, they relied on a cast iron stove cleverly traded, scavenged, or dragged across 2 states by mule cart. This stove was the crown jewel of the cabin, the kettle-holding, biscuit-baking, sock-drying, foot-thawing heart of the home. Its one flaw: it mostly heated whatever corner of the room it faced. If your back was to it, your bottom was in peril. At night, families didn't scatter to their own rooms like we do now, mainly because there weren't any. 1 or 2 beds supported a tangle of blankets, bodies, and the occasional dog who had earned a place by not biting anyone that day. Children, grandparents, and the sleep-talking uncle who always thought he was being chased by goats, all snuggled together under quilts that were made from a former wardrobe's fabric scraps. If someone had but a goose-down comforter, they were either fabulously well-connected or owed several favors to the town blacksmith. Outside, the wind could sound like 100 wolves debating dinner plans. But inside, the shared body heat, the occasional boiling pot of beans, and a hot brick wrapped in cloth placed under the covers, well, that created a microclimate of survival, not comfort. Survival. There's a difference. But it was enough. We also mustn't forget ingenuity in the face of frostbite. Heated rocks left by the fire and tucked into beds, drying clothes by hanging them on suspended ropes above the stove, which sometimes led to shirts sizzling into new, crunchy personalities, and using snow deliberately packed around food stores to create nature's first off-grid freezer. In emergencies, some used dried manure for fuel, a fact that really brings new appreciation to cooking over an open flame. In towns, if you were really fortunate, you might have communal heating. A general store or church might break out its best potbelly stove and let folks gather for warmth, a sermon, or an aggressive round of checkers. Coffee would be weak. Gossip would be strong. Yet somehow, with cracked hands and frost-nipped noses, they endured. Winter on the frontier was less about fighting nature and more about forming a quiet, uneasy truce with it. Bundled in wool, elbows deep in cornbread batter, folks watched the skies for mercy, or at least a break in the snow long enough to head to the outhouse. And speaking of outhouses, they deserved their own chilly spotlight. While the wind howled like a pack of prairie dogs with musical ambitions, and the stars blinked above like sleepy fireflies, a quieter challenge drifted across the snowy plains of the Wild West. Staying clean. Yes, cleanliness. That outlandish luxury 19th century pioneers rarely had the time or temperate water for. In wintertime especially, hygiene was less of a daily habit and more of an occasional adventure, one where frozen fingers and questionable decisions played starring roles. Picture it. It's January 1871. You're nestled inside a dim, creaky log cabin in the Dakotas, 30 miles from the nearest store, 3,000 miles from hot running water, and about a whisper away from giving up entirely on the idea of cleanliness. A bath, you ask? Huh. That requires both water you don't break with an axe and firewood you're not yet emotionally attached to. And so the age-old question arises: how did these brave souls prevent their skin from fusing permanently with their long johns? To put it plainly, they didn't. Not entirely. But they had tricks. Oh yes, clever, chilly little tricks passed around with equal parts frontier wisdom and mild desperation. The most common winter hygiene ritual was the legendary sponge bath, which had less to do with actual sponges and more to do with a wet rag dipped into a bowl of tepid water. A pioneer might warm a small pot of snowmelt over the stove, stopping just short of boiling because heat, like patience, was in short supply, and then proceed to give themselves what can only be described as a dignified dampening. Socks off, arms briskly rubbed, neck doused with the speed of a startled raccoon. Time was of the essence, because warm water became cold water in less than 30 seconds. This was science, or perhaps frontier sorcery. Each bath came with a silent prayer to avoid catching a chill, or worse, having to repeat it next week. Hair washing was even more rare. Women might wash their hair once a month, clenching through the ordeal like heroes of shampooless legend. Men, depending on their follicular situation, might opt for a bucket-over-the-head event followed by a run around the cabin, making noises last heard during buffalo stampedes. Conditioner wasn't even a twinkle in the apothecary's eye. Brooms, however, were essential, not for hair, although who's to say that didn't happen in emergencies, but for sweeping out the ever-present dust, soot, and general evidence of humans existing in enclosed spaces. You were never quite clean in a prairie cabin, but with enough sweeping and a little smoke chased out the chimney, you could at least appear marginally less feral. Laundry. Now, laundry was an event, and one best ignored until entirely unavoidable. In winter, doing laundry meant hauling water indoors, warming it to knee-scorching temperatures, adding the infamous lye soap, capable of stripping both stains and basic optimism, and scrubbing cloth until your arms declared mutiny. Rural women were known to schedule these snowy cleansing sagas once every few weeks, only slightly more often than celestial eclipses. When possible, garments were rinsed and then hung indoors to dry, transforming the main living quarters into a steam-filled jungle gym of frozen shirts and slightly thawing undergarments. Clothes could take days to fully dry. A damp pair of trousers might eventually be declared good enough, and courageously worn back into rotation, still slightly crunchy at the knees. And yet, despite the limits, frontier folk took pride in being as tidy as their conditions would allow. Guests might be greeted with freshly swept floors, a spicy pine-scented fire, and everyone in their Sunday best, worn over 5 layers of flannel, of course. Cleanliness, like frontier manners, was not always perfect, but it was sincere. They even had their own fragrances. Wood smoke behind one ear, faint beef stew behind the other. A little winter wind in the hair, and perhaps the joie de vivre of someone who had not fallen through the ice that morning. It was all quite rustic, and rather inspiring when you squint a little. So if your idea of a bath is 15 candles and a eucalyptus bath bomb, remember, once upon a time, folks cleaned up with snow water and willpower, and as the fire crackled and the laundry froze mid-air like ghostly pants of forgotten homesteaders, the long western night stretched onward, carrying with it the scent of pine, courage, and questionable conditioner. Let's wander a little deeper now into the world of winter, food, where survival meant snow-chilled biscuits and the thrilling risk of bean overload, far from the cozy crackle of a fire when the wild prairie winds sang their icy lullabies and snow whispered across the plains like powdered ghosts. Settlers had to find ingenious ways to stay warm. But make no mistake, this wasn't warmth in the modern sense. No cozy radiators, no insultingly small heated throw blanket from a general goods store, no chai-spiced candle. This was the kind of warmth earned with effort, sometimes desperation, and a great deal of stubbornness wrapped in wool. You see, there were countless log cabins scattered across the American frontier, But in the early days, not all of them came equipped with fireplaces or proper stoves. Why? Because building a proper chimney took time, skill, and materials settlers didn't always have. And for much of the 1800s, when pioneers rolled westward faster than chimney masons could follow, many folks wintered in dugouts, sodi, houses, or what historians affectionately refer to as half house, half hope. Now picture this. You're in a dugout, which is essentially a glorified hole in the side of a hill. Your walls are made of earth, your roof is Lincoln logs and wishful thinking, and your floor might be dirt, though clay if you were fancy. If you were unlucky, there was no fireplace at all, just a vent hole to let the worst of the smoke out and all the heat go with it. So how indeed did these frontier families avoid freezing to death in their burrow-like homes, wrapped in little more than wool, grit, and stubbornness? First, they wore every article of clothing they owned, all at once. This created a layered insulation system, not unlike a slightly moist onion. Flannel, wool, fur, and hide were the staples of the settler winter wardrobe, and if something was warm and didn't smell like raccoon entirely, they'd wear it. Mittens hung around inside buildings. People slept with hats on. If the cat survived the last coyote attack, it might be allowed to sleep on your feet. Second, it's hard to freeze when you never stop moving. And settlers, God bless their bony elbows, moved constantly, from dawn till dusk, and sometimes even halfway through the night. If the storm rattled the roof just wrong, people were chopping wood, tending animals, fixing roofs, hauling ice, or cooking beans that took an average of 9 hours to become chewable. And not the fun kind of beans either. We're talking about beans that dared you to enjoy them. Warmth came from more than fire. It came from motion, work, and body heat. Ah yes, body heat. Every settler family knew the sacred bedtime practice of the communal sleep pile. Beds were shared, sometimes layered like hay bales. If you were the family's dog, you were snuggled right in with everyone else, no questions asked. Some families went so far as to keep their chickens indoors during extreme cold spells, as long as you didn't mind the occasional feather grafting itself to your undergarments. Another trick for the fireless and furnaceless: heated stones. Simple, militarily sound logic. You heat a large stone near a fire, perhaps at a neighbor's chimney-equipped home, or from a shared community hearth. Wrap it in flannel or burlap and ferry it back to your cabin like an awkwardly warm baby. Slip it beneath the bedding or into a wooden box at your feet, and voila, primitive bed warmer. Settlers would treasure these stones more than their teenage sons during chore season. But one of the greatest secrets to surviving winter without fire was the insulating magic of snow itself. Yes, snow. Architects of the adobe and sod persuasion discovered quickly that once snow piled up around a dugout or sod house, it actually kept the temperature inside warmer, at least compared to the hurricane of frozen needles outside. Snow acted like Earth's giant, itchy sweater. As long as the roof held and no hungry weasel dug in, things stayed survivably chilly. Still, it must be said, winter without fire meant that many homes relied heavily on community. In the deepest cold, families might crowd into a single home in rotation, roast potatoes over one available fire, and pass the evening in shared silence and lumpy quilts. If that's not holiday spirit, I don't know what is. And as the season deepened, dawns were greeted with clouds of breath in the air and soup frozen stiff in buckets. Coffee froze, ink froze. Even conversation had to be thawed out with a little sass. Yet, day by day, ingenuity and sheer will kept these people alive. Which brings us softly to the curious case of pine pitch, oil lamps, and the not-so-small miracle of interior light. Out on the frozen prairie, in the creaking wooden skeletons of early Western homesteads, there was one unglamorous but crucial force that helped settlers survive the long, frost-bitten months of winter: manure. Yes, cow pies, buffalo biscuits, the frontier's most humble heat source. Now, before your brow stiffens with skepticism, let's sit gently with the facts. Plains settlers, especially those far from steady wood supplies, quickly discovered that dried animal droppings burn surprisingly well. Nature, in her infinite resourcefulness, had handed them a fuel supply that walked around in herds and politely deposited itself by the front door. Buffalo chips, as they were most politely known, weren't just burnable, they were downright efficient. Once properly dried by the sun, and preferably not during a snow squall, they caught fire like kindling and burnt at a slow, steady pace. In fact, some veterans of sod house life went so far as to claim that cow dung gave off a warmer, longer-lasting heat than kindling would. It may not perfume the air like cedar, but when the wind whipped through the cracks in your chinking and your beard crusted over with icicles, the smell of burning prairie pie was practically luxurious. One settler woman in Nebraska described her winter survival system as wood for quick warmth, buffalo chips for staying warm, and soap for judgmental guests. You can almost hear her smirk through the pages of history. Now, not all chips were created equal. Buffalo chips, revered by the indigenous tribes long before the settlers came, burned cleaner and drier than cow dung. Cattle had wet diets and, shall we say, a different approach to digestion. So when the buffalo herds began to dwindle, thanks in part to misplaced sporting enthusiasm among Eastern gentlemen, settlers turned to livestock to fill the gap. Children were often given the daily duty of chip gathering, an errand that proved both industrious and humbling. Picture little Harold or Esther tromping out with a burlap sack, poking around with a stick, hunting treasure piles around the yard. It builds character, frontier parents would say, a phrase that continues even now as a form of psychological weatherproofing. As night fell and sod houses glowed faintly from their interiors, the smoke curling from their chimneys wasn't always from oak or pine wood. It might have been the echo of yesterday's grazing, and the air inside, a bit musky perhaps, a little pungent with the perfume of practicality, was, above all else, warm. The ingenuity didn't stop with dung. Dried corn cobs were also pressed into fire duty. Once the kernels were off and the cobs had withered dry, they turned into brittle, fibrous torches. Settlers would stack them like stovepipe Lego, and though the heat didn't last long, it flared quickly enough to make a kettle sing or hands thaw. In Iowa, it was joked that families burned their way through their cornfields twice, once at harvest and again in winter. Further west, in treeless plains and wind-thrummed valleys, you might even find fires fueled with twisted stalks of sage, clumps of dried grass, or braided bundles of twigs collected over an entire summer. Fuel wasn't just an element of heat, it was a matter of daily strategy, like chess with kindling. Now, imagine the subtle music of that time, the rustling of a dried cow pie as it's placed lovingly into the stove, the crinkle of corn cobs simmering to ash. Outside, maybe a coyote yawned on a distant hill. Inside, the warmth may have carried the fragrance of animals past, but it filled boots and bellies all the same. And while eastern cities might boast crackling fireplaces of brick and iron, frontier families huddled close with resourceful hearts and a deep, slightly earthy appreciation for the unglamorous marvels of nature. As the night deepens and chimney smoke drifts up towards stars newly scattered, we'll journey next into the splendid oddness of what those sod houses were actually made of, and why some roofs occasionally decided to sprout in spring. If you ever find yourself standing knee-deep in snow beside a drafty log cabin, prepping beans over a lukewarm stove, and wondering why your ancestors didn't invent central heating by 1825, well, welcome to the average Tuesday for a Western settler in midwinter, particularly the kind of Tuesday where frost formed on the inside of their windows. That is, if they had windows at all. Some didn't. Some considered windows suspiciously luxurious. By the 1800s, the stubbornly cold heart of the American frontier was being bravely tackled by the ever-resilient, occasionally shivering, always really good at layering settler. And while we often imagine them wrapped in convenient flannel shirts from the general store or fur coats borrowed from Hollywood costume departments, their wardrobe was more pragmatism than polish, and a bit more pungent after a month without washing. But this chapter is not about laundry. No, tonight, we wander gently down the frostbitten lane to one of the sleepiest secrets of settler survival, the art of going semi-hibernal. You see, when the sun dipped below the ridge and the wine started muttering old ghost stories through the chinks in the cabin wall, settlers didn't always try to fight the chill. They leaned into it. Literally, they just slept more. Wintertime in the wilds meant there was less farming to do, unless your hobby was harvesting icicles or having polite debates with squirrels. So people slept. A lot. It's what folklorists sometimes call segmented sleep, a pattern observed even in Europe before the rise of electric lights. One long nap after sundown. An eerie, candlelit intermission sometime around midnight, where souls would wake up, talk softly, read scripture, maybe check the fire or quietly curse the firewood. Then a second stretch of slumber that might carry one through until dawn, if dawn showed up on time and didn't bring more snow with it. In some cabins, families curled together like a bundle of mismatched socks, children, parents, maybe a grandparent or two, piling under patchwork quilts, old raccoon pelts, and anything else that didn't have splinters. Personal space was measured in inches. Privacy was theoretical. And yet, somehow, sleep was sacred. It was the quiet ritual that promised warmth from within, even when the walls creaked with cold. A human adaptation as old as time. When you can't heat the world, you slow down and shrink your universe to a nest of blankets and bread crusts. Now, if you're wondering how one fuels such extensive hibernation, fear not. The evening meal, often served just before the long lie-down, was as thick and heavy as humanly possible. Picture a stew so hearty it could double as insulation. Beans, salt pork, potatoes, if they hadn't gone soft and weird in the root cellar, cornbread that could be used as a doorstop in an emergency. After supper came a ritual nearly as beloved as the quilt piling, the fire debate. Should we keep it going all night? Someone would ask, despite knowing perfectly well that this required hauling more wood from the frozen outside, possibly while being glared at by a raccoon. The answer was often no. Wood was precious, so was sleep. And chilly though it might be, those communal quilts, that elbow-to-elbow family cuddle, and a few strategically heated bricks wrapped in cloth, could keep hypothermia politely at the door. Well, most of the time. Yes, bricks. There's nothing quite like clutching a lukewarm rock to your chest, like it's a treasure from Mount Olympus. But when it was heated in the hearth beforehand, settlers swore by the humble brick as nature's battery pack. And judging by the scorch marks on historic bedding, some used theirs enthusiastically. Of course, not everyone simply curled into a blanket burrito to wait out the frost. For some, winter was a time for quiet crafting. Bone needles stitched future mittens in the fading light. Homemade candles, each a lumpy little miracle, were poured and trimmed by hand. Some settlers even took to carving spoons, because nothing says, "I'm fighting cabin fever," quite like the 11th spoon you didn't need. Still, the dominant activity, if we can call it that, was rest. Rest and survival stood hand in hand, shivering together beneath the rafters. And in that long hush between snowflakes and sunrise, the West took a breath and waited. Now, as the fire turns to embers and our settlers drift toward their second sleep of the night, let us leave them burrowed and breathing slow. Tomorrow, the bread will need baking and the bricks reheating. But for now, perhaps we, too, can close our eyes and let the hush of a simpler winter gently guide us onward. On the bleakest nights of the frontier winter, when the wind howled like it had an unpaid grudge and the stars were just showpieces in an otherwise frostbitten dome, there was one unlikely beacon of hope, the humble, slightly underappreciated root cellar. Not much to look at. These underground shelters sat quietly near homesteads, like shy toads hiding in the grass. They were usually dug into hillsides, or wherever the earth offered a bit of cooperation, and covered in sod, logs, or sometimes just wishful thinking. Inside, however, they were marvels of frontier ingenuity. Natural refrigerators, perfect for keeping potatoes, jars of pickled green beans, and the odd frightened chicken if need be. Now, you might not think escaping the winter by crawling into a hole in the ground sounds either innovative or cozy. But allow me to paint you a picture. Imagine freezing temperatures above, snow pressing against the world like a heavy quilt woven by angry sky spirits, and you tucked inside the earth, surrounded by the scent of turnips, dill, and security. Root cellars weren't just food stores. They served as temporary refuge when blizzards moved faster than horses. Children would spend hours hunkered down with lanterns and jars of applesauce, listening to stories about the summer sun they no longer remembered. One prairie child famously stayed warm by wrapping himself entirely in dried corn husks. His mother, unamused when she discovered him looking like a scarecrow sculpture, simply said, "Next time, add butter and salt and roll yourself into a supper." It's easy to romanticize the rustic frontier life with its carved rocking chairs and steaming porridge, but the settlers weren't striving for aesthetics. They were enduring, fighting off frostbite with wool socks repurposed 3 times, heating rooms with nothing but body heat and well-timed sarcasm. In fact, when fires weren't an option, say during travel, fuel shortages, or nights when the wind made lighting a match feel like trying to teach a goose to juggle, frontiers folk relied on layers. We're talking shirts over shirts, underpants under more robust underpants, and a system of shawls and aprons wrapped so intricately that one could suffocate before managing to unbutton to use the outhouse. And speaking of the outhouse, yes, let's. Because in this era, relief came with a price, venturing outdoors. To answer nature's call in sub-zero temperatures was less about necessity and more about courage. Wise families kept a chamber pot indoors, which essentially amounted to a bucket with dignity. There were ice warnings, elders reminding children not to linger, else they leave pieces of themselves behind, whatever that meant. Likely something to do with unfortunate accidents and the peril of frost on unsuspecting parts. But one particularly odd tradition emerged in certain settlements during especially harsh winters. Warming stones. These were rocks, heated in whatever contraption offered warmth. A fire, a stove blaze, or sometimes just in a mother's ever-simmering stew. Much to everyone's surprise when dinner tasted like gravel. The stones, once hot, were wrapped in cloth and tucked under blankets or carried in pockets to bed. They often retained warmth for hours, and settlers whispered to one another like they were passing along family heirlooms. The flattest stones hold heat the longest. They didn't have microwaves, but they had rocks with reputations. And let's not forget the classic technique of shared heat. That's pioneer terminology for everyone into the bed at once. Whole families squeezed under quilts stuffed with whatever insulating material they could find, which, in desperate times, included hay, feathers, or the dog. It wasn't uncommon for settlers to awaken, find their breath suspended mid-air like a small ghost, and ask no one in particular, did I survive the night, or am I marinating in an extremely cold purgatory? But had you asked them, most would have said, sleep was possible, peace was achievable, and sometimes, oddly, these freezing nights brought everyone just a little closer. Physically, emotionally, and at least once, unintentionally, when two brothers knit their long underwear together and couldn't separate until spring. As the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the frost whispered secrets along the window panes, another technique quietly carried families through the prairie winter. Imagination. In the darkness, with knees pulled to chests and mug handles clutched tight, they told stories of seasons to come, of green shoots and dances under sunlit skies. And as the howling wind began to fade into a tired moan, they drifted off with dreams of thawing earth and the forgotten sensation of warm socks. Somewhere, just beyond the snowbanks, something else stirred. There's frost on the mustache again. It's the kind of observation that could ruin a morning for a man in Boston. But out on the frontier, somewhere in the rolling, snow-swaddled silence between Nebraska and nowhere, it was simply part of winter fashion, the settler's equivalent of wearing a scarf, if a scarf occasionally froze to your upper lip. Toward the colder heart of December, when the sun decided to phone it in, and folks measured daylight in half-hearted afternoons, frontier homesteaders had already shifted into a kind of sleepy resolve. Survival was less about bravado and more about routines designed by necessity and powered by stubbornness. Mornings began not with alarm clocks or oat milk lattes, but with the ritual of not freezing to death. Blankets, made heavy with wool or old flour sacks stitched together, were peeled off like bark shucked from a log. The air inside a sod house or log cabin was usually just a few degrees warmer than outside, unless you'd had the foresight and 4 hours of dry squinting to keep that fire going overnight. Now remember, these were homes without insulation, thermostats, or that cozy, deceitful hum of central heating. They had cracks in the walls big enough to let in a prairie breeze or a very polite raccoon, depending on your local fauna. Windows, if you had them, were often oiled paper stretched tight over a wooden frame. Glass was a luxury, usually reserved for churches and wealthy banker types whose fireplaces were mostly decorative and doubled as places to store seasonal pine cones. In the morning, one poor soul, usually whoever lost the rock, paper, scissors equivalent of you, me, or Ma, would be in charge of lighting the fire in the cook stove. This stove wasn't just for breakfast. Oh no, it was the very heartbeat of the home. It provided the heat, the tea, the biscuits, the hot water for washing, and the general illusion that life wasn't entirely unbearable. The iron beast roared to life under careful hands, with dried corn husks, old newspaper clippings, or sometimes cow chips used for kindling. Yes, cow chips. Dried up reminders of a bovine's dinner, collected dutifully during warmer months and stacked like poo-scented firewood next to the cabin. Nothing says homestead luxury, quite like flammable manure and a good pair of wool socks. Baths were another consideration, too frequent, and your water reserves and sanity ran dry, too rare, and you risked becoming your own ecosystem. Most families compromised by declaring an official Saturday bath night. Water had to be hauled, heated, and then shared, often with Mr. Oldest Child going first, and little baby Sadie stewing in what could only be called murky optimism by the end. If a guest arrived during this weekly gala, they were usually invited to partake, somewhere between the middle child and the neighbor's goat. Clothing, for its part, transformed into a sort of wearable architecture. Men bundled into woolen union suits. Imagine pajamas fused with long underwear and the consequences of poor design choices, and then layered with flannel, denim, and a coat built like a burlap tent. Women wore petticoats upon petticoats, like wearable lasagna, topped with shawls and knitted plugs for wherever wind dared poke its nose. And speaking of noses, it was best not to rub them too hard in the cold. Frostbite was remarkably democratic. It didn't care how strong your constitution or how many poems you'd read about the beauty of snow. Ears, fingers, toes, and hearty cheeks were at constant risk. Folks developed an intimate relationship with grease. Lard, bear fat, or goose grease would be applied to exposed skin before venturing out. It helped trap warmth and made your face smell faintly like dinner. This had the added benefit of keeping bears politely curious, but mostly uninterested. Evenings were the quiet crown of each day. After the cows were checked on, the woodpile was replenished, and someone remembered to shove a rag into the biggest drafty knothole in the wall. Families gathered close around the stove. There would be mending, whittling, maybe a hymnal or a story told by Grandpappy about that time he outran a blizzard by sheer force of squinting. The wind would howl just outside the chink to the best of your ability logs, but inside, under the patchwork of quilts and the smell of parsnip stew, there was something tender. A home burrowed deep into the cruel season like a hibernating imagination. Laughter came easier when the worst had already been endured, and the best was simply keeping each other company in the flickering firelight. As nights grew longer, so too did dreams, filling with tin kettles that never went cold, mittens that never got wet, and chimneys that didn't smoke backwards during strong gusts. Out there, in the lonely sprawl of prairie and pine, settlers built warmth against the void, soul first, fire second. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the next snowfall, another challenge waited, a small storm named food storage. But that, too, would be met with patient cunning and a deep inhale of whatever passed for coffee. Out on the wind-hushed prairie, the days grew shorter, the nights deeper, and the cold. Well, the cold made opinions out of everyone. And by opinions, I mean lots of complaining. Quiet, stompy-footed, mitten-muffled complaining. Now, by this point in winter, folks on the frontier weren't just battling the kind of cold that turned breath into little ghosts. They were also juggling the creeping monotony of long winters without much more entertainment than arguing over whether or not beans counted as a vegetable. Yes, Eunice, they do. Stop asking. But tonight we're not talking about beans, thankfully. We're talking about how the average settler bundled against Mother Nature's most aggressive mood swings without the benefit of central heat or even reliable firewood. because while many imagined the Wild West as a place of shootouts and saloons, truth be told, most people spent winter trying very hard not to lose toes. You see, prairie winters were long, wind-bitten things, and many settlers lived in sod houses, those half-buried, earth-walled homes that looked like a hobbit starter home, but somehow colder and with 100% fewer wizards. The sod house, or soddy, was more than just a home. It was a clump of prairie shaped like a cube, filled with dreams, and smelling strongly of whatever you cooked most recently. People said the walls breathed, which was poetic for mud leaks when it rains and also freezes when it freezes. But the insulation, surprisingly decent. Dirt, it turns out, is nature's weighted blanket. To maximize warmth, settlers slept in what was called a community bundle. That's a very pioneer-sounding phrase for what was essentially one large human lasagna. Layers of family members, thick quilts, and the occasional dog, all stacked like frontier parfait. The small children, they were the middle layer, always, not by chance but by strategy. Dogs were welcome bedfellows, especially the small, spunky kind who radiated heat like tiny sleeping embers with paws. Someone in North Dakota even wrote, "A good terrier is worth 2 logs of wood," and unlike logs, the dog would lick your face in the morning. An affectionate but effective wake-up strategy. Layers, of course, were everything. Wool undergarments formed the first line of defense. The word itchy doesn't quite capture the texture of pioneer wool. Imagine wearing a disapproving sheep. Over this went petticoats, shirts, vests, jackets, shawls, and, on the coldest nights, a favourite bit of frontier fashion, the sleeping bonnet, a knitted cap tied securely under the chin, guaranteed to make one look both cosy and vaguely like a disgruntled muffin. Now, indoor heat. That was always a bit subjective. If you had firewood, and if you weren't rationing it with military precision, a cast iron stove might chug along all night. But many homes, especially on the high plains, were nowhere near a single tree, and gathering wood involved hauling driftwood, buffalo chips, yes, those chips, or trading with someone who had an ox, a saw, and ambition. Enter the cowpie stove, a marvel of American ingenuity and olfactory endurance. Dried buffalo dung was a prized fuel, abundant, earth-friendly, and mostly effective, so long as you didn't mind the fragrance, which switched between barnyard smoky and aromatic panic. But those who learned to stack, dry, and store patties in the fall could enjoy a reasonably warm cooking fire throughout winter, and probably an immune system made of steel. And then there was stone-heated bedding. Pioneers would heat flat rocks or bricks by the fire, wrap them in flannel, and place them under the covers at bedtime. This little pioneer hot water bottle often warmed toes or kept baby calves snug inside the house during particularly cruel storms. Yes, some families did share their homes with shivering livestock during blizzards. The cow might sleep beside the cradle, keeping baby company and the floor from freezing. It was a time of great closeness and absolutely no boundaries. Some settlers swore by the Scandinavian technique of straw under mattresses, stuffing beds with hay and reshuffling it weekly to avoid mold and unwanted guests. Nothing says goodnight like rolling over onto 3 beetles and a confused grasshopper. And then there was what I like to call winter optimism, that peculiar brand of frontier cheerfulness that insisted, despite everything, that the cold couldn't last forever. Or if it did, at least it kept the neighbors from visiting too often, which was sometimes its own kind of luxury. As they fell asleep to the creaks of frozen timbers and the occasional howl of a coyote making his thoughts known, settlers found comfort in the things that lasted: warm quilts, warm dogs, and the warm hope that tomorrow's sunrise might come with just a whisper less wind. And speaking of wind, next we drift through the breezy world of wintertime communication. How letters, gossip, and news travelled faster than you'd think across the frost-bitten frontier. By the time late December settled over the frontier plains, the air hung with a silence so complete you could hear a cough echo from one homestead to the next. The snow, having finally quit its performance of dramatic entrance, now lay flat across the landscape, a passive-aggressive reminder that firewood was finite and noses were not self-heating. And in this wonderland of frostbite and optimism, the settlers turned to a technique that involved neither matches nor miracle stoves. Instead, they employed nature's least glamorous, yet surprisingly efficient, solution to staying warm. Livestock, yes. Cows. The original heated blanket, sort of. Now before you turn up your well-insulated nose, imagine this scene: a one-room log cabin with more gaps in the walls than boards, one smouldering hearth giving out its dying embers of heat like an underpaid intern, and somewhere in the corner, a family cow named Bess, chewing cud and radiating the kind of steady, warm breath you'd expect from a sentient space heater. This, dear listener, was known as barn sharing, or, for those who preferred their euphemisms, artisanal and pasture-raised, integrated livestock lodging. The idea was brilliantly simple. House the cow in the same structure as the humans. The body heat from a 1,000-pound animal did, in fact, help warm the space. And no one complained too loudly, because the alternative was shivering off your boots in your sleep. Historians have recovered diary entries that speak of such winter arrangements. One Minnesota settler wrote, "Tonight we moved Daisy inside. Her moo echoed something awful, but my toes is thankful. The children named her Aunt Roasty." It is left ambiguous whether Daisy was flattered. The Scandinavian settlers, who had crossed oceans and mediocre ship food to reach America, brought with them a design called a loft barn, where the family lived above the stable. Heat, being both lazy and inclined to rise, drifted upward through the wooden floors, warming the living spaces. So, while your boots might sometimes smell of hay and hoof polish, at least supper came with a side of circulation in your limbs. Now, house sharing with cows wasn't always warm cuddles and bovine lullabies. Sometimes, these cloven-hoofed roommates proved, let's say, enthusiastically aromatic and flatulent, particularly in winter, when diets took a hard turn toward the whatever's left in the root cellar variety. Still, even these drawbacks were occasionally viewed as part of the charm. As one settler's letter laments, "The cow passed gas so mightily last night, I thought the Lord had returned in sulphur, but at least it cut the cold." Beyond cows, smaller livestock made guest appearances too. Chickens often nested under beds for mutual warmth, serving as nature's feathered foot warmers. Pigs, when small, sometimes nestled beside children, arguably more cuddly than a hot water bottle and marginally better behaved. It may sound odd to the modern ear, having your barnyard within reach of your bunk bed, but in the frontier, survival always took precedence over comfort or odor. Besides, there was a certain hushed companionship in the barnroom setup. The soft clucking of hens, the slow exhale of a sleepy steer. It was as if the cabin's crude walls held not only cold, but shared breath, shared warmth, a mutual, sleepy agreement to survive together. And it's worth pausing, mid-yawn, to remember just how communal survival truly was. While many settlers embraced the lonesome image of rugged individualism, winter had a quiet way of reminding everyone that being alone was greatly overrated. Even your ornery goat had a role in keeping the cabin above frostbite temperatures. Some evenings, after the chores were done, the frost scraped off the inside of the windows, and the youngest child had mistaken the sheepdog for a scarf again. The family would sit near the hearth and sing. Simple songs, off-key, drifting up into rafters shared with creatures who, earlier that day, had been chewing through someone's bonnet. Thus, amid the hay-strewn, hoof-stamped charm of a multi-species household, warmth crept in, not only from heat, but from the kind of comfort that came from not being entirely alone in the cold. And just beyond those cabin walls, where the wind threaded its fingers through the gaps and the snow sighed down from the roof, lingered the next big challenge: food. Because now that you're warm, you'd best figure out what on earth you're going to eat. By the time December's breath painted frost over every water bucket and cabin window, the true victor of the West was revealed. Not the fastest gun, the richest prospector, or even old Doc Haskell with his bootleg whiskey syrup cough eliminator. No, the real winner was anyone who had figured out how to insulate their backside from a frozen outhouse seat. And in 1870s winter frontier towns, that took either genius, desperation, or an extra bearskin. But let's not skip ahead to outhouse strategies just yet. Back where snowy drifts turned trails into traps and every handshake froze halfway through, the settlers of the American frontier had to turn to nature for thermal wisdom. Thankfully, they had models, the animals. And no, they didn't domesticate wolves to carry hot soup. They watched how creatures survived, studying the puffed-up feathers of prairie chickens or the snow-snuggled dens of badgers. The result? Pioneers began copying those adaptations, though usually with far more uncomfortable stitching. They stuffed cracks with mud and moss, packed their boots with straw, and in more than a few cases, lined their underpants with squirrel pelts. Yes, squirrel pelts. A little bristly, but boy did they do the job. Comfort was relative. Dignity, optional. One of the most curious tricks involved the buffalo robe burrito. It wasn't a culinary invention, though heaven knows those cold evenings could have used one, but a way to sleep with a chance at waking up with all 10 toes. It involved lying on the dirt floor, layering a series of furs over oneself, and rolling into them like a human sausage in a meat-based sleeping bag. Guaranteed to trap body heat, and as several diaries confessed, every unpleasant odor one could imagine. The cabins themselves were lo-fi masterpieces. Logs were stacked with tighter precision than a tax collector's ledger. Gaps between them, called chinking, were filled with a hearty mix of clay, straw, and spit, though hopefully not from the same bucket. A good chink job kept the wind out. A bad one turned your kitchen into a snow globe. Many pioneers learned a valuable lesson during their first winter. Heat rises. And unfortunately, so did precious warmth from their potbelly stoves, drifting smugly up to the rafters while feet froze on the floor below. Some families started building sleeping lofts, curling up under the peak of the roof. Others simply accepted cold feet as part of life, alongside wolf howls and the general disappointment of boiled turnips. Speaking of food, the winter diet was more strategy than cuisine. Without much fresh produce, folks relied on root vegetables, dried beans, salted pork and hardtack, the original jaw workout. Canning was a lifesaver. Jars of preserved peaches sat on shelves like amber jewels, to be opened only on birthdays or when someone had an unusually persistent cough or disagreement with a spouse. There was no refrigeration, because everything was refrigerated. Meat was hung from hooks outside, frozen by nature. Milk, if you had a cow generous enough to give it at 15 below, was often stored in snowbanks. Some folks even hollowed out natural snow cellars under the floorboards, though crawling down there in your long johns took either valiant courage or an argument so bad you couldn't stand to be in the house another minute. For warmth, humans turned to the most reliable resource they had: each other. Entire families often shared one bed, not just for space or closeness, but for shared body heat. There are tales of toddlers sleeping crosswise at the foot, wrapped in thick quilts, their noses peeking out like chilly puppies stuffed under a rug. Snoring became a sort of frontier lullaby, punctuated occasionally by someone yelling out from a dream or dislodging the entire blanket layer in pursuit of a warmer patch. Candles were both precious and problematic. Too much wax at once and you'd be smothered in fumes. Too little and you'd stub your toe on the butter churn. Or worse, on the surprisingly sharp end of a sleeping sheepdog. Oil lamps entered the scene, using lard, whale oil, or, if you had the modern fancy, a little kerosene, which always smelled faintly like ambition mixed with smoke. And so, bundled in every available fabric, fed on preserved ambition, and illuminated by the flicker of home-concocted hope, winter nights passed slowly, but not without charm. Even as the wind rattled the shutters and snow climbed the walls like frosty ivy, settlers would murmur old stories, sharpen tools by lamplight, or simply listen to the creak of timbers as their humble homes stood defiant against another winter gust. But beyond the cabin walls, where moonlight glazed the snowdrifts, silver and the stars stitched silent approval overhead, a different kind of survival story played out. One under hooves, in dens, and stoveless shelters beneath the frozen prairie. After weeks of nibbling on root vegetables, mushy beans, and stale sourdough, you might think that frontier folk spent their winters grumbling about food more than the weather. And you'd be partially right. But in a land where ice would form inside your cabin, if you said something too chilly, food wasn't just comfort. It was survival, morale, and the closest thing anyone could get to a warm hug without actually hugging a warm cow. Come winter, the settlers' diet shifted from questionably diverse to fashionably monotonous. Fresh produce that had long since turned into compost, or, more likely, been turned into jars of pickles 3 months ago. So the pantry treasures of the season were things you could either dry, salt, smoke, ferment, or entomb in snowbanks. And the last of those was hardly ideal if wolves or your neighbour's livestock got there first. Let's contemplate the glory of the root cellar, that dark, subterranean haven tucked beneath cottages and cabins. It was damp, a little mouldy, and smelled like last autumn's turnips left in a room with no ventilation and too much ambition. But it worked. Potatoes do remarkably well in a hole in the ground, as do carrots, onions, and any vegetable that takes pride in looking unwashed and lumpy. Without refrigeration or modern preservatives, pioneers turned preservation itself into an art form. Think of it as the culinary equivalent of knitting a scarf, with dried corn instead of yarn. You had drying racks hanging from rafters, strings laced, with apple slices like fruity garlands, and jerky harder than your in-laws' opinions, all gracefully suspended above the hearth. Speaking of jerky, that leathery strip of animal commitment, it was both a protein source and a good test for one's jaw strength. It came in 2 styles: overly salted or excessively smoked. Either way, you'd need about 10 minutes of silent contemplation before each bite. Some folks got so used to chewing jerky slowly, they reportedly started using it as a unit of time. I'll be there in 2 jerks of a venison. Molasses, meanwhile, was the sweetener of choice, not because it was particularly beloved, but because sugar was more rare than a polite prospector during a gold rush. Honey was nice if you happened to live near benevolent bees, but molasses was thick, enduring, and made porridge taste less like despair. Pioneers poured it on cornbread, dropped it into tea, and occasionally convinced themselves they liked it. And what of meat, darling? Meat, with the rivers freezing and game becoming scarcer, either hibernating or just better at hiding. Settlers relied largely on what they'd already preserved. Smoked ham, cured bacon, and salted fish all made strong appearances. The saltiness was legendary. So much so that some frontier memoirs included complaints of bacon too bold or ham that offended the senses. Amusingly, during long blizzards, everyone seemed to invent ways to dress up the same 10 ingredients. Cooks became improvisational artists, tossing flour with dripping and calling it biscuit dough, or rebranding yesterday's beans as Wednesday stew. It wasn't just food, it was imagination play. And a good imagination could make salted fatback taste almost poetic. As for drinks, water was boiled, when wood allowed. Snow was melted carefully, so as not to scorch it. Yes, that's a real complaint. And coffee, when available, was rationed like gold dust. In its absence, people would brew up roasted, chicory, toasted grain, or something indefinably bitter from a nearby shrub. Some even pressed boiled molasses with burned toast to simulate aromatic depth. The results were not always drinkable, but they were always memorable. Of course, many families kept a small stash of dried apples or crabapple jelly for special occasions, like Christmas or when you found that missing mitten. Conserving food became a badge of skill, passed down in whispers. Aunt Hester once got through an entire January on one side of pork. She was either a wizard or an extremely light eater. Food wasn't just nourishment now. It was heritage in a jar, hope in a soup pot, and the loudest conversation topic by lamplight. Meals were humble but shared, and every bite reminded people not just of survival, but of the curious, clever ways they had adapted to make winter not just bearable, but sometimes even a little delicious. And beyond the pantry, there were rituals, cozy customs, snowy happenings that turned long winters into stories worth repeating. And as the evening embers burned low and frost traced little cathedrals across the window pane, those stories, stitched with laughter and a good spoonful of exaggeration, were just beginning to brew. As the prairie turned silver under a gauzy winter moon, the settlers of the West tucked themselves into their quilts with a little more hope than science. You see, survival was often less about strategy and more about sheer stubbornness mixed with a pinch of improvisation and a few cups of strong tea. Preferably brewed not from tea leaves, mind you, but from boiled pine needles or roasted dandelion roots, because grocery stores, alas, had not galloped westward just yet. When the wind began its nightly siege, rattling shutters like an impatient ghost and slipping through every plank and chink, it was up to the humble homestead to act as both shield and shelter. Early American cabins weren't exactly airtight. In fact, some of them seemed to breathe harder than the occupants. The logs shrank and shifted, leaving gaps wide enough to let in everything but a polite invitation. To combat the cold, settlers turned to a most unexpected ally: mud. Yes, mud. Or more poetically, chinking. A concoction of mud, clay, straw, sticks, and wishful thinking was mashed into the gaps between logs to stop the drafts. Chinking was reapplied yearly, lest the wind unravel it like an old sock. And while it wasn't elegant, it was earnest, and it sometimes even worked. Of course, Insulation wasn't just about plugging holes. It was about turning everything into a buffer. Curtains were thick, often made of old wool or linsey woolsey, that delightful blend of linen and wool that itched like gilt and wore like iron. Floor rugs were more than decorative. They were thermal armor for the toes. Newspapers pasted on the walls added both a layer of insulation and a side of last year's headlines. Many a cowboy. Nursery was warmed by headlines from 1882. Clothing, let us not forget, doubled as furniture. Nightclothes were less pajamas and more three-layered woolen negotiations. One wore most of their wardrobe to bed, for warmth and just in case they needed to sprint outside to chase off a bear, patch a leak, or wrestle the wind for the roof. Socks were rarely matching and always numerous. Quilts, on the other hand, were downright heroic. These patchwork masterpieces were often made over years, quilted by hand and passed lovingly or breathlessly through generations. Each square told a story. A dress worn at a wedding, a rag salvaged from a journey, a scrap from a shirt too threadbare to mend. To sleep under such a quilt was to be swaddled in history, and about 12 pounds of fabric. If you fell asleep under 3 quilts, you usually had to be rescued with a stick. The real art, though, was in group heat. Families slept in one room, often sharing a single bed that creaked in protest with every shift. Children doubled as little heat radiators, strategically placed at the foot of the bed or tucked like firewood along the edges. Pets, too, were highly functional in the cold months. A dog snuggled against your legs could be the difference between a brisk sleep and becoming part of the cabin floor. And what about babies, you ask? Well, the same ingenuity applied. Many were swaddled so tightly they could be mistaken for stuffed sausages, then tucked into wooden cradle boxes near the stove, if you were lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, they were kept close, tucked beneath their mother's shawl or sleeping beside her, 2 hibernating creatures wrapped in the woolen arms of borrowed warmth. Even more fascinating was the nocturnal ritual of the homestead lantern. Families used tallow candles or tin lanterns for light, carefully rationing fuel. A gentle flicker of flame often cast long, dancing shadows across low beams, a nightly theatre of both comfort and caution. Fire, after all, was warmth, but also risk. It had to be fed and watched, like a sullen uncle. By midnight, the wind still howled, but inside those log cocoons, huddled humans dreamed in layers of spring, of sunrise, of a time when toes might feel warm again. They didn't need central heating. They had wit, wool, and sheer audacity, and perhaps a warm stone, wrapped in rags and placed at the foot of the bed, warmed earlier by the hearth. A small gesture, yes, but out here in the stubborn wilds of winter, it was the kind of genius that sparked endurance. So, with the fire low, the quilts high, and the moon casting tired light across the frost-glazed windows, the west settled under its blankets of silence and snow, just as something odd began to clang against the side of the house. Settlers didn't believe in ghosts, but maybe they should have. Or maybe it was just the wind again, fiddling with something metal. The next evening, they'd find out what, out west, winter was less a season and more a test. A slow, creaking exam in survival where the questions were written in frost and the answers were scrawled in smoke, if you were lucky enough to have smoke at all. By the time snow blanketed the prairie like a poorly tucked sheet, settlers faced the one challenge they couldn't shoot, negotiate with, or avoid: keeping the human body functioning when temperatures dropped lower than a snake's belly in a well. Wood, for instance. Critical, essential, noble wood. An entire economy of winter warmth revolved around those blessed logs, but trees weren't always at hand, especially for homesteaders living on the high plains, where the only trunks visible were dusty travel trunks, not pine, no oak, no ash, just grassland singing mournful songs under the snow. When firewood was merely an idea, a luxury on the horizon, they turned to something less desirable but startlingly effective: cow chips. Yes, the dried cakes of bovine byproduct became the prairie's unlikeliest hero. Easy to gather, easy to dry, and already pre-processed, these humble patties made surprisingly consistent heat. Families referred to them as prairie coal, though the term buffalo briquettes was also in circulation, probably invented by someone who couldn't help but add flair to unfortunate topics. Picture a frosty evening, the biting wind whistling through the cracks in the door frame, icicles decorating your windows with threats of atmospheric intention, and inside, a small cast iron stove burning a curated selection of last summer's cow contributions, sizzling gently, aromatically questionable, but undeniably warm. More than just warmth, settlers had another foe to battle: air. Or rather, the lack of fresh air inside those tight-sod homes and dugouts. With windows few and insulation often made of earth and newspaper, ventilation was an afterthought, usually noticed only after Aunt Hilda fainted halfway through breakfast. Carbon monoxide didn't write calling cards, but it made its presence known. So families learned to crack the door just enough to avoid carbon-drenched naps. And they kept fires low and steady, because roaring flames meant faster fuel consumption. And in the economics of freezing to death, those chips, cow or otherwise, needed to last. Sleep was no breezy affair either. People didn't climb into bed so much as they hibernated in strategic layers. Entire families slept in one room, often in one bed, under a mishmash of quilts, coats, and whatever fur still had its original owner's scent. Children were tucked in so tightly it was less bedtime and more burrito deployment. Nightcaps weren't just fashion statements either. Those knit caps were essential, lest your dreams come with frosty ears and eyebrow icicles. Now, there were occasional forays into innovation. Some clever folks, particularly in Scandinavian and German immigrant communities, brought with them the old country magic of heated bedstones, chunks of rock or iron heated in the fire and then swaddled in cloth before being slipped under bed covers. They behaved like prehistoric hot water bottles, only guaranteed never to spring leaks. These little heroes could keep a bed cozy until long past the rooster's delayed crowing. Of course, for those who had a bit more, shall we say, financial insulation, there were full-on iron stoves the size of livestock, parlor stoves, wood-fed, coal-fed, sometimes attitude-fed, with elaborate scrollwork and names like the Herald or Warmet No. 9. These stoves didn't just heat rooms, they became household celebrities. Children were told to keep their distance, not out of safety, but out of respect. You didn't sass a stove that kept you alive all night. And yet, for all the hardship, there was a kind of rhythm and romance to winter living. Evening routines, layering up, stoking the last fire, telling stories lit only by the amber, glow of coals, created a closeness that even central heating can't replicate. They didn't have Wi-Fi, but they had warmth from a dozen shared quilts and a few spirited debates over who forgot to gather chips that afternoon. The ice-rimmed windows, the breath fog hanging in the kitchen, the scratchy warmth of wool against sleep-heavy limbs, all combined into memories stitched as tightly as their patchwork bedding. No furnace, no electric blanket, just ingenuity, patience, and an occasionally roasted cow chip or two. And somewhere in the soft crackle of whatever the stove permitted, be it wood, dung, or divine intervention, another night settled gently over the prairie. As temperatures dropped and the winds howled their winter lullaby, another secret of prairie survival stirred just beyond the back door, involving one peculiar companion whose fur was warmer than any fire. While today we might associate corn husks with decorative door wreaths and the questionable texture of certain eco-friendly packaging for settlers in the Wild West, husks were the closest thing to department store goods. A commodity of peculiar versatility, they padded pillows, lined boots, got stuffed into children's dolls, and, perhaps most nobly of all, served as insulation in log cabins that creaked at every gust of winter wind. Ah yes, insulation, that great unsung hero of warmth. Long before fiberglass batting and spray foam became part of some poor contractor's daily vocabulary, pioneers made do with what they had. And what they had was debris, glorious debris, mud mixed with straw, rags made from clothes that died in service, and moss, so much moss. Moss ticked many boxes. It muffled drafts, carried the faint scent of forest melancholy, and, critically, didn't fight back when you crammed it between the logs of a shack. A true team player. Settlers in colder climates like the Dakota Territory or the higher elevations in Colorado often practiced a charmingly desperate tradition known as chinking and daubing. This meant plugging every wooden gap in their log home with whatever could plausibly not ignite within 10 seconds. Clay was good. Clay with straw was better. Clay with straw and horsehair whispered of high fashion. Interior design in these cabins swerved between utilitarian and whatever we could carry. Walls were adorned with quilts hung like tapestries. Not for style points, although Aunt May might insist they matched the curtains, but for insulation. A well-placed patchwork quilt could block a draft, hide a knothole, and if the need arose, serve as a quick cover if you'd accidentally kicked off the covers during a particularly ambitious dream about chasing a bear out of your vegetable cellar. Windows, or more often, the holes where windows should be, were another battleground in the war against frostbite. Glass was rare and prohibitively expensive. So many settlers stretched oiled paper across wooden frames, effectively turning each window into a kind of blurry suggestion of the outside world. It let light in mostly, and kept wind out mostly. And if the paper flapped ominously at night, folks would simply pull their wool hats down a little lower and blame ghosts, rodents, or both. Speaking of wool hats, fashion during winter wasn't a matter of runway readiness. It was a matter of staying alive. Layering was essential. Wool, under fur, under regret. Many settlers, keen to mimic the survival skills of indigenous peoples, who, to no one's surprise, had figured out how to thrive in these climates long before homesteaders started building their drafty weather traps, took to wearing buffalo robes or moccasins lined with rabbit fur. Unfortunately, many also ignored more crucial indigenous wisdom, such as how to store food properly or not build a lean-to in a floodplain. But when it came to staying warm, desperation is a reliable teacher. At night, families would huddle together in the common single-room design of most homesteads, which was efficient in its efficiency. One room, one stove, one family. Children often slept together for warmth, a time-honored tradition that mostly worked until someone wet the bed. The floor, possibly made of packed earth, offered all the insulation of a cold biscuit. Settlers laid down thick rugs when possible, usually woven from old clothes, potato sacks, and optimism. Some would even drop heated stones wrapped in flannel at the foot of the bed, a kind of settler hot water bottle, though one imagines more than a few slapstick scenarios involving scorched toes and midnight yelps. For those lucky few who did have access to a stove, whether built of iron or cobbled together from whatever metal could be scrounged, the fire still had to be babysat deep into the night. Wood was piled strategically, sometimes even slept on, so the person on night stoking duty could add a log without getting too far from the blankets. One could delight in the romantic notion of a roaring hearth, until they noticed just how much heat got sucked up the chimney and delivered directly to the indifferent stars. Still, amidst the drafts and mouse-chewed mittens, there was a certain triumph in surviving winter without fire so much as outwitting it. Pioneer resilience wasn't always about conquering nature. Sometimes it was just about living politely alongside it, wrapped in a quilt, sipping something hot if you were lucky, and praying the roof held through the season. And so, while winter outside howled like a disappointed opera singer, inside the settler's cabin it was quiet, if you didn't count the occasional creak or cough, or the gentle thump of a raccoon trying to steal your dried apples. But what, you might ask with a shiver, did they eat when crops were months away and groceries were a myth? Let's take a soft, snowy step further into that. Out on the prairie, where the wind whistled lullabies through the gaps in log walls and the stars gossiped overhead, the arrival of winter meant more than just cold fingers. It was the season of moving less, talking slower, and, most critically, eating creatively. Because when the snow came down like an unpaid tab at a saloon, trips to town for supplies were out of the question, and settlers had to survive on what was already tucked into their root cellars, pantries, or, if you were particularly unlucky, a solitary barrel of pickles and a strong stomach. Food, in those freezing months, was less about flavor and more about function. Although, in the hands of a determined homesteader, a sack of dried beans could be transformed into something bordering on poetic. Picture a cold, creaking log cabin, wind moaning like it skipped breakfast, and a bubbling pot of bean stew hanging over a small fire, sending up steam and the humble perfume of survival. Now, you might be wondering, didn't we say no fire, no furnace? Quite right. But let's not forget the difference between fire and roaring blaze. Your average homesteading fire wasn't exactly the crackling cinematic inferno we imagine today. It was more likely a tiny flame, carefully coaxed into a semblance of life, burning low and blue with a pile of precious, hand-split wood rationed like gold dust. Settlers conserved firewood the same way we conserve phone battery in an airport with no outlets. Carefully, nervously, and often with genuine prayer. Which brings us to the art of keeping warm, using food. Because yes, a hot meal did more than warm your spirit. It literally warmed your insides. A wedge of cornbread, fresh off the griddle and wrapped in a cloth, wasn't just breakfast. It was a hand warmer, and once you ate it, it doubled as internal heating. Porridge became both insulation and emotional support. Some folks even went to bed with warm potatoes tucked under the blankets like sleepy bricks. Multi-purpose carbs, delivering calories, comfort, and something resembling central heating. Beans, of course, were a winter staple. Not just because they were shelf-stable and nutritious, but also because cooking them gave you a reason to linger around the stove. Boil them slow, stir them gently, and you could hover by that little fire for hours without anyone accusing you of laziness. But not every settler was so fortunate. When firewood ran out, or when the weather was so cold the fire refused to start, yes, fire could be moody too. Families had to rely on room temperature methods, cold leftovers, hard tack softened with snowmelt tea, or root vegetables gnawed so slowly they became a meditative practice. Some particularly clever families had dug deep root cellars, not just for food storage, but also for insulation. These underground hideaways stayed relatively mild year-round, making them the coziest and eerily quiet spots during the coldest months. Children would scamper down there under quilts and nibble on dusty apples, while their parents muttered hopeful things about spring. And then there were the treats. When the holidays crept over the horizon like a sheepish guest, settlers pulled out the hidden stash: a jar of preserved jam, a tin of molasses cookies, a single orange brought up from the cellar like a sacred relic. These were the moments winter felt less like survival and more like a ritual. Someone might even sprinkle cinnamon over mean-looking porridge and call it pudding, because with the right storytelling, anything could be pudding. Preserving food was already an elaborate art form by this point. Canning, fermenting, smoking, drying, all done before the first frost swept over the plains. Even ice boxes, rudimentary contraptions that used blocks of real ice and sawdust, allowed for a kind of primitive refrigeration, though in February, the world itself was one gigantic freezer. The real challenge was not freezing your elbows off when going to retrieve dinner. And let's not forget the community meals, rare but cherished. When a neighbor showed up with a pie still warm from a carefully hoarded ember, it wasn't just dessert. It was an act of survival solidarity. These potlucks were full of mismatched offerings: sourdough biscuits beside pickled beets, squirrel stew sharing table space with something proudly declared as clabber cheese. It was a buffet of resourcefulness and friendship, plated with hope. But as long nights grew longer still and snow piled higher than the windowsills, food became something more than nourishment. It was a link to better weather, brighter days, and memories of gardens yet to grow again. Later, as the embers dimmed and the last spoonful of stew was carefully scraped from the pot, those same settlers would lie down under heavy quilts, bellies warmed, hope intact, listening to the quiet whistle of snow dancing outside. And in the heart of winter, under low ceilings and higher dreams, something else quietly simmered: plans. Tiny sparks of preparation, ready to bloom when the thaw came. But that little spark deserves its own quiet moment. Soon, by the time winter really settled its heavy bones across the American frontier, when your breath hung like a ghost in the barn, and even the snow seemed too tired to fall, the homesteaders started talking less and wrapping up more, like burritos with opinions. And by burritos, of course, I mean humans who'd learned how to turn a sackcloth into a sleeping system, a meal into a memory, and a frozen outhouse ordeal into a strange point of pride. Now, you'd think at this point in the season, they'd be relying on good old-fashioned fires to keep warm. Fires and dreams of California. But the truth is, settlers weren't exactly roasting chestnuts on an open hearth every evening like in a Victorian postcard. Wood was precious, fireplaces were needy, and your average cabin was draftier than a senator with a secret. Instead, survival meant knowing exactly how to make the most of what little warmth nature let slip. One old technique, particularly beloved by Scandinavian immigrants, was banking. Not financial, mind you. No stocks were involved unless they were firewood stocks tucked into a clay and ash bank in the fireplace. Before bed, the fire was banked, covered with ashes in just the right way, to keep embers warm until morning without actually burning through the night. It was a simple little sorcery that meant you didn't have to stumble out in the dark and wind to fetch firewood while half asleep and mostly frozen. Sometimes, just keeping heat inside was the high art. Homes were insulated with whatever was handy. Earth if you could dig it. Buffalo pelts if you could catch them. Newspaper if you could read it. And even dried grass stuffed into wall cracks by hand. The result? A home that crackled like a bird's nest and occasionally smelled like a renegade hay bale, but was marvelous at trapping body, heat. Settlers weren't just clever with their buildings, they were downright strategic with their bodies. What you wore to sleep wasn't always what we modern folks call pajamas. It was more often every layer you had left. Long johns, a second shirt, a third shirt, maybe your Sunday wool if you didn't mind dozing off in the same outfit you'd be buried in someday. And piling into bed wasn't a solo venture either. Large families often shared beds out of both necessity and the basic physics of body heat. Picture it. 2 parents, 4 children, possibly a cousin or 2 riding out the storm, all sandwiched in a creaky wooden frame with a patchwork quilt, heavy enough to count as exercise. It was communal, it was cozy, and it was just barely enough. But the most underrated ally in the settler winter arsenal was the humble hot water bottle, or, more precisely, the frontier version of one. Glass wasn't practical, and rubber wasn't a household item yet, so people made do with heated stones wrapped in flannel, or yes, baked potatoes straight from the hearth. You'd pop one into a sock or bundle it in cloth and tuck it under the covers like a tiny edible furnace. In the morning, you had breakfast, if it lasted the night. Half of frontier heating was just good planning for meals. And let's take a moment, if you will, to observe the true backbone of warmth logistics: the family dog. Unlike some of today's pets who require emotional support from weighted blankets and gourmet kibble, these were sturdy creatures with paws like snowshoes and a suspiciously deep understanding of drafty chimneys. A good farm dog would curl up at the foot of the bed, or frankly, anywhere body heat was radiating, and act like a living, breathing bed warmer. Trade you one loyal mutt for 5 logs any day. On the truly bitter nights, when the sky was the color of tin and the stars looked like they might snap in half from the cold, people turned to storytelling. Not loud, tales, no shouting or banging of dishes, just soft murmurings around a slowly dying ember, the room lit more by memory than flame. They'd tell stories of warmer places, of distant relatives who claimed Montana summers were almost tropical, of what they'd plant when the thaw came. Whispers and dreams hung in the smoky air, half hopes spun into lullabies. And somewhere between those murmurings and that last long smoky breath of the fire, sleep would settle over the room like a quilt. We'll rest here too for tonight, and when we stir again, we'll step at last into the thaw, into what happened when winter finally loosened its grip, and the earth began, ever so shyly, to breathe again. As the final logs crackled down to embers and the wind softened its breath against the cabin walls, the sleepy heartbeat of the frontier pulsed gently into the night. Winter in the Wild West didn't end with a bang, but with the hush of melting snow, the creak of wooden door hinges waking from frost, and the long, slow yawn of frozen earth preparing for thaw. By the time spring winked on the horizon, the settlers had survived yet another cold season without the comforts of modern heating, or, in some cases, even a proper stove. They had relied on the wisdom passed between calloused hands. Tuck the chimney draft with a potato, not because it works, but because it gives you something to complain about, while everything else freezes. Not everyone had a fire, remember. Some leaned hard on their sod houses, or dugouts half swallowed by hill and snow. Those little earthen cocoons kept heat surprisingly well, assuming one didn't mind the occasional mouse performing acrobatics on the frost-dusted ceiling. Others pressed oilcloth over windows, blocked door frames with buffalo hides, and slept embraced in a tangle worthy of a Victorian etiquette panic. And, as improbable as it might seem, with all that shivering and stew scrounging, there was joy woven through it. Not always, the loud kind. There weren't many parlour pianos being played while snow collected in the hallway, but the quiet variety. A mother darning socks by the stub of a tallow lamp, while her children, dressed in so many layers they resembled overstuffed beanbags, pretended to be asleep to avoid chores. A father counting dried beans like a banker with a briefcase full of doubts, marvelling at how far they'd come with so little. Outdoors, the homestead's livestock too had their own sleepy winter routine. Chickens stopped laying long ago and stared blankly into the snow, plotting nothing and achieving less. Cows, wearing a permanent expression of mild confusion, released faint clouds with each breath, as though auditioning for a ghost story. And the horse, named Chester or Daisy or Plate, depending on the child's imagination that week, waited through the quiet storms, dreaming, perhaps, of grass that wasn't frozen into something resembling a Civil War biscuit. And those curious weather phenomena, ice fog, hoarfrost, and the seemingly magical return of daylight by the inch, reminded the settlers that survival wasn't just about grit. It was also about rhythm. The land had its clock, and they, even in their patched underwear and mismatched woolens, had learned to tick with it. There were, of course, cautionary tales passed around during the long hours. Legendary neighbours who had tried to melt snow over a lantern and only succeeded in giving themselves third-degree irony. Or that one fellow who spent a week wearing every item of clothing he owned, lost a boot, and was found trying to barter a spoon for firewood with the family dog. No one ever really knew if they were true. But in the dark hush of winter evenings, softly chuckled stories felt warmer than fire. In the end, survival was partially about heat, sure, but mostly about spirit. It was the kind of defiant optimism only humans dare muster. The belief that even if the walls are thin, the butter is frozen, and the well pump groans like it's cursed, there will still be spring. Sometime next month. Probably. And so, as the final breath of winter drifted across the plains, our settlers stretched out tired legs, wrapped themselves in patchwork quilts, and exhaled into silence. Their world, bare bones and frostbitten, had asked much of them and offered little in return beyond the profound intimacy that comes with enduring hardship side by side. Now the lanterns are dim, the embers sigh their last red glimmers, and in a corner someone hums a lullaby made of old hymns and newer hope. Gentle fingers trace the edge of a mug, still warm from chicory brew, and outside, the snow softens into slush, like the earth deciding to loosen up a little. For now, there's nothing left to do but rest. The storm has passed, the candle's done its job, and the long night of winter in the west has folded quietly around its people, like a mother tucking in children who've somehow made it through. Sleep well, wanderer. The frontier will wait.